Welcome to our deep dive into philosophy. You've given us some pretty cool stuff to work with this time, including parts of Sophie's world.
Yeah, Sophie's World. That's a good one.
So we're going to tackle some really big questions, the kind that have kept thinkers busy for ages, and we'll see how they connect to us today.
It's amazing how philosophy can help us figure out our lives, even with all the craziness in the world today.
Totally.
It's like having these tools to think better, to know what questions to even ask.
I like that. It's a good toolkit for your brain.
Exactly.
So let's dive right in. Sophie's World is great at showing how these big philosophical questions often come from simple, everyday things. Like, haven't we all looked up at the stars and wondered where everything came from?
Totally. That feeling of wonder, that's what gets philosophy going.
Right.
That childlike curiosity makes us question things we thought we knew.
And speaking of childlike curiosity, you sent in something about how important play is for kids to grow up right.
Oh, yeah.
It reminds me how kids are like natural philosophers,
Mm-hmm.
always asking why and pushing the limits of their world.
That's a great point. We can learn a lot from that, I think. Philosophy isn't just some abstract ideas floating around.
Yeah.
It's about really getting involved with the world around you, like experimenting and being open to new things.
It's about playing.
Yeah, exactly.
Sophie's World uses Norse myths to explore these early philosophical questions.
Oh, cool.
I love how those myths deal with the unknown,
Yeah.
trying to make sense of the forces shaping our lives.
Yeah.
It's like those ancient storytellers were dealing with the same big life questions we face today.
They totally were. And it's amazing how, after all these years, those stories still mean something to us. And you can trace a direct line from those myths to the pre-Socratic philosophers who were trying to explain the world using nature, not by blaming everything on the gods.
Right. They were looking for answers outside the realm of the supernatural.
Right. And we start with Thales, who thought everything came from water. Then you've got Anaximander, who believed in a more abstract boundless as the source of all things.
I like that, the boundless.
Yeah, very poetic. And of course, we can't forget Anaximenes. He thought air was the fundamental element.
It seems like they were trying to break the world down into its simplest parts.
Yeah, trying to find that one basic building block. And even if their theories sound kind of simple to us now, they were pioneers in trying to understand the world logically and systematically. They were setting the stage for, like, the scientific method.
They were the OG scientists.
Exactly, laying the groundwork.
But it wasn't just about simplification, right?
Yeah.
Empedocles came up with his 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water.
Right, the classic 4.
He thought all change in the world came from these elements mixing and separating. It's a pretty elegant idea when you think about it.
Oh, yeah. And it still makes sense in a lot of ways. Think of the seasons changing, or how water can be liquid, then ice, then steam. Empedocles was onto something, trying to get at the heart of how things change and stay the same.
Yeah, like what are the underlying rules of the universe?
Exactly.
And then you have Democritus with his idea of atoms, these tiny particles that make up everything. Crazy to think he came up with this over 2,000 years ago without any of the fancy tools we have now.
Totally mind-blowing. And it's still essential to how we understand physics and chemistry, like nanotechnology, where they manipulate stuff at the atomic level, or even Lego blocks, you're building something new from basic units, just like Democritus imagined.
That's a really cool way to put it. Makes it much easier to grasp. It makes me wonder about how we organize information in our own lives. Are we lumpers who like to put things in broad categories? Or are we splitters who like to break things down into smaller and smaller bits?
Oh, that is such a good question. I like that. It speaks to how our minds try to understand the world, always looking for patterns, connections, trying to find the underlying logic.
And as we keep going, we're going to see how these early ideas about reality set the stage for some of the most important thinkers ever.
Like Socrates and Plato. They take these questions about knowledge and what's real to a whole other level.
And your interest in Athens,
Yeah.
based on what you sent in, is going to be super helpful here. We're stepping back in time to that awesome intellectual energy of ancient Greece.
I love it. Picture yourself in the agora, that bustling marketplace, but for ideas. Socrates is there, debating, challenging people's beliefs, making them think harder about the world.
Okay, I'm there. What happens next?
Well, Socrates wasn't into just small talk.
Right.
He was after the truth, looking for those universal definitions of justice, virtue, the good life. How do we even define these things? And he did it by asking questions constantly. It's called the Socratic method.
I've heard of that. It's about asking the right questions, not just taking things at face value.
Exactly. And it's still so relevant today. We're flooded with information from everywhere. It's more important than ever to be able to really think about what we're being told and form our own opinions.
So Socrates was kind of a troublemaker, right? I mean, challenging those big beliefs in public. You're going to upset some people.
Oh yeah, he definitely shook things up. And you can imagine, not everyone liked it. He ended up on trial, sentenced to death.
Wow, for real?
Yeah, they said he was corrupting the youth and being impious, which basically meant he didn't believe in the state's gods.
That's intense. To be condemned for your ideas makes you realize how powerful philosophy can be, how it can threaten those in power.
Totally. It's like it's showing a mirror to society, exposing its problems and contradictions.
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's kind of like holding power accountable. And Socrates' death, it became this symbol for the fight for intellectual freedom, something we're still dealing with today.
We are, you're right.
Think about all these debates about free speech, censorship, what we're allowed to even talk about. Socrates was wrestling with those same things over 2,000 years ago.
Makes you think. But his ideas didn't die with him, right? His student, Plato, took those ideas and ran with them, built a whole philosophy around them.
Exactly. Plato was super influenced by Socrates, but he also took it further. He came up with this whole theory about knowledge, reality, the good life, everything really. And one of his most famous ideas is the theory of forms. He explains it with this awesome story called The Myth of the Cave.
Okay, I remember reading about that in Sophie's world. It's about those prisoners chained up in a cave, right? They can only see shadows on the wall.
Right. Those shadows, they represent that limited knowledge we get from our senses. But if one of the prisoners escapes, climbs out into the sunlight, he sees the true forms of things for the first time. It's like going from a world of illusions to reality itself.
Wow, that's powerful. It's like those moments when you suddenly see things differently, like you've broken free from some mental trap.
That's exactly it. And for Plato, those true forms, those unchanging essences, that's what real knowledge is. The world we see and hear and touch, it's just a pale copy of this higher realm of forms.
But wouldn't that make philosophers, like, super elitist, like they're the only ones with the truth?
That's a good point. Plato's critics definitely brought that up. But for Plato, the philosopher's job is to guide others out of that cave, help them see things more clearly. It's about education, showing the way to knowledge.
So not about hoarding knowledge, but sharing it.
Right. And I think that's really important, that philosophy isn't just for academics. It's about taking those ideas and applying them to the world to make things better.
So from these super high-minded forms of Plato, we come back down to earth with Aristotle, who is way more interested in the everyday details of the natural world.
You could say Aristotle was like an early scientist.
Right.
He was fascinated by life, all its different forms. He spent years just observing and classifying plants and animals, trying to figure out what made each one unique and how they all fit together in nature.
And speaking of classification, you sent us this cool article about the history of libraries, how they've organized information over time. It makes me wonder, how would Aristotle have organized his own library? It must have been huge.
He would have loved that. It's a great way to think about a key difference between Plato and Aristotle. Plato was after those abstract forms, the big picture stuff. But Aristotle, he was all about the specifics, the details of the world around him. He was a master of observing and categorizing.
And it wasn't just nature he categorized. Aristotle used his logic on ethics too, came up with a system all about balance, moderation. That's where we get his famous idea of the golden mean.
Right, the golden mean. It's about finding the sweet spot, the middle ground. Not being extreme in either direction, but finding that perfect balance where virtue lies.
But doesn't that sound kind of, boring? Like, aren't there times when we need to be bold, take risks, go against the flow?
Oh, totally. And it's good to remember, Aristotle wasn't saying be a bland follower. The golden mean isn't like a one-size-fits-all rule. It's about figuring out the right balance for each situation, each person. It's using reason to guide your actions and make choices that lead to a good life.
So it's less about being average, more about finding what works for you.
Exactly. And his ideas, they have this huge influence on Western thought. From medieval times to modern science, you see it everywhere.
It's wild to think how these ideas from ancient Greece are still shaping how we think today.
They are. But the story of philosophy doesn't stop there. As the Greek city-states started fading and the world became more connected, new schools of philosophy popped up. all with different ideas about happiness and purpose in a world that felt shaky and uncertain.
This is the Hellenistic period, right? A time of big changes and upheaval.
You got it. And during this time, four big schools of thought became really popular: Cynicism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Neoplatonism.
Okay, so break those down for us a bit. What were the Cynics all about?
The Cynics were kind of like the ancient Greek hippies. They were all about rejecting material things, social norms, anything they saw as fake or unnecessary. They thought true happiness came from being self-sufficient and living in tune with nature.
So going back to basics, like a minimalist lifestyle.
Exactly. They saw simplicity and authenticity as the keys to a good life. Now, the Stoics, they were different. They believed virtue was the only true good. We should focus on what we can control and accept whatever happens with calmness and peace.
So it's about inner strength, being resilient when things get tough.
Exactly. And Stoicism has had a comeback lately, with people finding comfort in its ideas about managing stress, overcoming challenges, finding meaning when things are hard.
I can see why that would appeal to people today for sure. So what about the Epicureans? Weren't they all about pleasure?
Well, kinda. They did believe pleasure was the ultimate good, but it wasn't about just indulging yourself all the time. They thought you should pursue long-term well-being, choosing pleasures that lead to lasting happiness, not just fleeting gratification.
So more like being mindful and making choices that are good for you in the long run.
Precisely. They thought true pleasure came from simple things: friendship, deep thinking, a life without pain and worry. And lastly, you've got the Neoplatonists, who tried to mix Plato's ideas with mystical elements from different traditions. One of their main figures is Plotinus, who had this vision of the universe coming from a single divine source, a concept that had a big impact on both religion and philosophy.
So they were sort of bridging the gap between philosophy and spirituality.
You could say that. They were trying to understand how the material world connected to the divine, how the finite connected to the infinite. And these Hellenistic schools weren't just abstract ideas. They offered real guidance on dealing with everyday life, from coping with loss and hardship to finding purpose and connection.
It's fascinating to think how all these different schools were around at the same time, like a real marketplace of ideas.
It was a really dynamic period in intellectual history. And as we head into the Middle Ages, we see how these Hellenistic ideas continue to shape Western thought, even with the rise of Christianity in Europe.
So we're about to see a clash of the titans. Greek and Roman philosophy versus the Judeo-Christian worldview.
It's going to be epic, a clash that would define the intellectual landscape of Europe for centuries.
So the Middle Ages, right? Christianity is becoming a big deal. But they're not just tossing out all the old ideas, are they? Seems like there's this mixing of the old and the new.
It's a real blend, yeah. You see thinkers like St. Augustine trying to combine Christian beliefs with Plato's philosophy. He was really into Plato's idea of a higher realm of forms, but for Augustine, those perfect forms became like the concept of a perfect God, existing beyond time and space.
Yeah. So they were using those old ideas, finding new ways to talk about those big questions about ultimate reality.
Yeah. Exactly. And for Augustine, the human soul was on this journey, couldn't rest until it found peace with the divine. This idea became super important in Christian thought, and it still speaks to people today.
But then there's that question of evil, right? If God is all good and all powerful, why is there so much suffering?
Yeah, that one's a tough one. It's been bugging theologians and philosophers forever.
For sure.
Augustine really struggled with it. He thought that evil wasn't really a thing itself, more like the absence of good, like a spiritual darkness.
That's a deep thought. And you sent in some stuff about the philosophy of religion, and it goes deep into all these different views on this problem of evil.
It does. It's a complex issue.
It really is.
And we're still debating it today. But Augustine's ideas had a huge impact on Christian beliefs, shaping how people understood God, humanity, and how they relate to each other.
So fast forward a few centuries, and we have St. Thomas Aquinas. He's trying to connect Christian faith with Aristotle's philosophy.
Aquinas, now there was a sharp mind. He was amazing at systematic thinking. He really believed that reason and faith weren't enemies. They could work together. He said some truths about God could be figured out through reason and observing the natural world. It's called natural theology.
So it's not about picking sides, faith or reason. Aquinas thought they both led to knowledge.
Exactly. It was a big deal back then. Aquinas really solidified the intellectual foundation of the Catholic Church. His ideas are still being studied and debated today.
So then things begin to shift again. We're leaving the Middle Ages, entering the Renaissance. Feels like an explosion of creativity and new ideas.
The Renaissance was all about rebirth. Literally, with a renewed interest in classical learning and human potential. It was about rediscovering ancient texts and pushing the limits in art and science.
And the printing press, that must have been huge, right? Knowledge could spread so much faster and farther.
Oh, it was a game changer. Think of it as the social media of its time. Suddenly, everyone could access knowledge. It fueled the Reformation, which challenged the authority of the Catholic Church.
And that questioning of authority, that was the heart of the Renaissance, wasn't it? This real sense of challenging the way things were.
For sure. Figures like Martin Luther said people should have a more direct relationship with God, emphasizing personal conscience and the Bible as the ultimate guide.
And this led to the scientific revolution, right? People started looking at the world differently.
Exactly. Thinkers like Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, they challenged the idea that the Earth was the center of everything. They proposed that the Earth actually revolved around the sun.
Wow, that's radical.
It was a huge shift in how people saw things.
I can only imagine the reaction. Challenging those in power who wanted to keep things the old way must have caused some serious tension.
Oh, definitely. But the evidence was piling up, and new ways of observing and experimenting were leading to these incredible discoveries. And then came Isaac Newton, who completely transformed our understanding of the universe with his law of universal gravitation.
Newton, he was brilliant. He showed that the same force that makes an apple fall from a tree also controls how planets and stars move. It was a mind-blowing theory that explained the workings of the cosmos like never before.
And that had a massive impact on philosophy, you know? Suddenly, humans weren't at the center anymore.
We weren't the main characters anymore.
Nope. We were part of this vast, complicated system ruled by natural laws.
It's crazy to think about how those discoveries changed our understanding of our place in the universe.
It really is. And this new worldview set the stage for the Enlightenment, a period that celebrated reason, individual freedom, and the power of human ingenuity to solve problems and improve society.
A new era where reason takes the lead.
Yeah, you could say that. The Enlightenment was a time of intellectual excitement. Thinkers like John Locke, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, they offered fresh perspectives on knowledge, ethics, how government should work. They believed reason could illuminate the world and guide us to a more just and fair society.
That's a powerful idea. It's interesting to contrast that with the Romantic movement, which kind of pushed back against the Enlightenment's focus on reason. The Romantics were all about emotions, intuition, the amazing beauty of nature.
They thought the Enlightenment was too cold and rational.
Right.
Romantics emphasized things like imagination, creativity, and how art can move us and inspire us.
You know, you sent us that beautiful poem by William Wordsworth, and it really captures that romantic spirit, that feeling of awe and wonder you get from nature.
Perfect example. And this back and forth between reason and emotion, the objective and the subjective, that tension continued in philosophy throughout the 19th and 20th centuries.
And speaking of those centuries, that's when some of the most profound, maybe even challenging philosophical ideas came about. Hegel, Marx, Kierkegaard, each of them tackled the big questions in their own way.
True giants in the field. Hegel saw history as this grand unfolding of reason, a process he called the dialectic. He believed history was moving towards a deeper understanding of itself, like a journey towards self-awareness.
So history is like a journey of self-discovery, not just for individuals, but for humanity as a whole. Pretty big idea.
Yeah, it's a big one. But then Marx came along and took Hegel's dialectic, but he gave it this materialist spin. He said it wasn't ideas that drove history, but economic forces. How we produce and distribute goods, that's the real driver. This led him to his critique of capitalism. He thought it was built on exploitation and would eventually be replaced by a communist revolution.
And Marx's ideas really resonated. They had a huge impact on movements all over the world, sparked debates about class, inequality, how economics shapes everything.
No doubt. His work is still relevant today, especially his analysis of capitalism.
Now, Kierkegaard, he was different, more focused on the individual, the choices we make, and the responsibility that comes with them. He emphasized faith, but not blindly following dogma. For him, faith was a leap into the unknown, trusting in something beyond ourselves.
He's considered a forerunner of existentialism, a philosophy that stresses individual freedom and the search for meaning in a world that can feel absurd. He wrote about anxiety, despair, the struggle to live authentically when things feel meaningless.
So 3 very different thinkers, Hegel, Marx, Kierkegaard, all offering unique perspectives on the big questions.
And that's what's so cool about philosophy, right? There's no one right answer. It's about asking the important questions, exploring different viewpoints, and challenging what we think we know.
Then we get to the 20th century, things get even more complicated. We see existentialism coming back, feminism rising, new ways of thinking about science, technology, the environment. It feels like the world was changing faster than ever, and philosophy was trying to keep up.
It was a whirlwind of a century. Philosophy reflected that. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus, they dug into themes of freedom, responsibility, searching for meaning in a world that had been through wars and was facing the threat of nuclear disaster.
And Freud, wow, he really changed things up with psychoanalysis. Digging into the unconscious mind, saying we're driven by hidden desires we don't even realize.
Freud was a game changer, not just in psychology, but in literature, art, everything. He gave us new ways to understand ourselves, our dreams, our fears, why we do the things we do.
And all this was happening while science was making crazy leaps forward, like quantum physics, which blew up our understanding of reality. The universe turned out to be even weirder and more complex than we thought.
And with those discoveries came new philosophical puzzles. What is reality, really? What are the limits of what we can know? How are mind and matter connected? It was a wild time to be thinking about these things.
It wasn't just science pushing boundaries. The 20th century saw all these social and political movements challenging the old power structures, demanding equality and justice.
Oh, yeah. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, anti-colonial struggles, they all impacted philosophy deeply, leading to new ways of thinking about gender, race, power, our responsibilities to each other and the planet.
So it's clear, philosophy isn't just this abstract thing happening in ivory towers. It's connected to what's going on in the world, the social, political, and scientific shifts all around us.
Totally. And that's what keeps it interesting. Philosophy is about engaging with the world, asking those big questions, trying to understand what it means to be human in all its messiness.
This has been a wild ride exploring all these ideas with you. I hope our listener feels inspired to keep exploring too. There's so much more philosophy out there to discover.
And the cool thing is, you don't need to be a professor to get into this stuff. Philosophy is for everyone. It's about being curious, asking questions, being open to seeing things in new ways.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those conversations going.